32 nations. That is the current membership of NATO, the alliance that has been the cornerstone of Western collective security since 1949, the alliance that every American president since Harry Truman has called the most successful military partnership in human history. The number of those 32 nations that have issued a statement of support for the American military operation in Iran: 0. Not one. Not a carefully worded expression of solidarity, not a diplomatic acknowledgement of American concerns, not even the kind of performative communiqué that alliance members routinely produce to paper over disagreements. Nothing. Complete institutional silence from the organization that is supposed to represent the collective security interests of the Western world, directed at the operation being conducted by the alliance's most powerful member. And this week, it got worse. The European Union's Foreign Policy Council convened an emergency session and produced a formal joint statement, signed by all 27 EU member states, describing the American military operation in Iran as, quote, conducted without the legal framework or multilateral consultation required for Allied support, and calling for an immediate ceasefire and negotiated diplomatic resolution. Not silence this time, a formal document, 27 signatures, filed with the United Nations Security Council, against the American position. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how 32 NATO allies moved from supportive partners to institutional critics in 11 weeks, sourced from EU Council documents confirmed by the Financial Times, NATO internal communications obtained by Der Spiegel, and diplomatic correspondence cited by Le Monde and The Guardian. I am going to show you the specific mechanism by which European diplomatic rejection translates into American strategic isolation, not just in the Middle East, but in the Pacific, in trade negotiations, in financial markets, and in the multilateral institutions that America built and now finds arrayed against it. And I am going to tell you why the world of American foreign policy right now is measurably more constrained than it was 60 days ago. Not because Europe is hostile, but because Europe has concluded that acting as though it is not is no longer sustainable. The alliance did not break dramatically. It broke administratively. 27 signatures on a document filed at the United Nations. And the administration's response was a social media post. The United States didn't just lose Allied support for a military operation. The United States triggered the first formal multilateral diplomatic statement by its closest allies, describing an American military action as legally inadequate and requiring cessation. That has never happened before. In the 50-year history of Western alliance politics, NATO members have disagreed privately, abstained publicly, and occasionally expressed concern diplomatically. But 27 nations signing a joint document calling for an immediate ceasefire against an American military operation, that is not a disagreement. That is a verdict. And the distance between a disagreement and a verdict is the distance between a relationship that can be repaired and one that has to be rebuilt from a different foundation. Trump planned for NATO unity behind American leadership. He got 27 signatures asking America to stop. And in the gap between the unity he assumed and the verdict that arrived, the alliance architecture that has been the organizing principle of Western security for 75 years is being redesigned. Not by adversaries, but by the allies who built it alongside America and are now deciding what it looks like without American leadership at its center. Imagine you are the founder of a company. You built it from nothing. You set the rules. You established the culture. You hired the first employees. For decades, the company ran on your vision and your authority. Then, over a period of years, you began making decisions that the people you hired disagreed with, sometimes privately, sometimes in internal memos, sometimes loudly enough that clients noticed. Each time the disagreements were absorbed, the relationship held. Until one day, 27 of your most senior employees filed a formal grievance with the board, in writing, on the record, describing one of your major decisions as legally and procedurally inadequate. They did not quit. They did not stage a walkover. They filed a document. And the document, formal, institutional, indelible, changed the nature of your authority in that company permanently. Not because they overpowered you, because they documented that your authority was being exercised in ways they were no longer willing to ratify silently. Hold that thought, because that is the precise moment the Western Alliance entered this week. And the document filed at the United Nations is the grievance that changes the terms of the relationship going forward. Drop your answer in the comments. Did Europe's formal rebuke of the American military operation represent a principled defense of international law? Or was it European strategic positioning that prioritized their own interests over alliance solidarity in a moment that required unity? Both readings exist. Both have consequences. Let us rewind the clock. This didn't start with a joint statement. It started 18 months ago, in a series of European foreign policy decisions that each looked reactive, but that collectively represented a systematic preparation for precisely this moment. The acceleration of the European Strategic Autonomy Project, the EU's effort to build an independent defense and foreign policy capability. The deepening of the EU-UK security partnership that had been stalled since Brexit. The Franco-German joint initiative on European defense procurement that explicitly reduced dependency on American systems. And the quiet reconstruction of the European diplomatic backchannel with Iran, the one that American maximum pressure policy had systematically undermined, through the E3 format involving France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The Trump administration's entire European alliance management strategy was built on one catastrophic assumption: that European governments were too economically and militarily dependent on American security guarantees to ever formally break with American foreign policy in a public, institutional, documented way, and that this dependency would continue to function as a veto on European diplomatic independence, regardless of how far American unilateralism pushed. The German Foreign Ministry published an analysis challenging this assumption directly, not as a classified document, but in a public policy paper released 14 months ago and available on the ministry's website. The paper argued that the dependency the administration was relying on was asymmetric in ways American policymakers consistently underestimated, that Europe's military dependency on America was real, but declining as European defense investment increased, that Europe's economic exposure to American trade policy was a constraint on, but not a prohibition of European diplomatic independence, and that the accumulation of unilateral American actions was systematically eroding the domestic political consensus within European governments that had historically made alliance loyalty reflexive rather than calculated. The paper was published, the assumption held, and 14 months later, 27 foreign ministers signed the document that the German Foreign Ministry's analysis said was coming. Receipt number 1, the EU Council Statement. Hat tip to the Financial Times, which obtained the full text of the EU Council's joint foreign policy statement 12 hours before its official release and confirmed its authenticity with 3 European diplomatic sources. The statement is significant not just for what it says, but for what its existence means legally and institutionally. Under EU foreign policy architecture, a joint statement of all 27 member states requires unanimous agreement, including from Poland, the Baltic states, and the Nordic countries, which have historically been the most pro-American members of the European diplomatic community. The fact that those governments signed this document is not a detail. It is the most important fact in the document. The statement does 4 things. It formally characterizes the American military operation as conducted without the legal authorization required by international law, specifically citing the absence of a UN Security Council resolution, a formal Article 5 invocation, or a collective defense determination under any recognized multilateral framework. It calls for an immediate ceasefire and the opening of multilateral diplomatic negotiations under UN auspices. It notifies the United States that EU member states will not provide intelligence sharing, logistical support, overflight rights, or diplomatic cover for the continuation of the operation in its current unauthorized form. And, this is the element that received the least coverage in American media, it formally requests that the International Criminal Court's prosecutor review the legality of specific military actions conducted during the operation, under the Rome Statute provisions governing the conduct of armed conflict. Stop right there. That 4th element is not symbolic. An ICC prosecutor review request, filed by 27 states simultaneously, triggers a mandatory preliminary examination under the Rome Statute. The United States is not a member of the ICC and cannot be compelled to participate. But the ICC preliminary examination creates a legal record, an international legal record, of the specific military actions being reviewed, the states requesting the review, and the prosecutor's findings. That record does not disappear when the conflict ends. It sits in international legal history as the documented moment when 27 of America's closest allies asked the world's primary international criminal court to examine American conduct in a military operation. That is not Europe cutting off America. That is Europe creating a permanent institutional record of its objection. And permanent institutional records do not get walked back by a press release. Receipt number 2. The intelligence cutoff. Here is the part that should make your blood boil. The EU statement's provision on intelligence sharing is not rhetorical. It is operational. And the American military and intelligence community has known it was coming for 3 weeks. Because 3 weeks ago, according to reporting by Der Spiegel, confirmed by 2 current European intelligence officials speaking to The Guardian on background, the intelligence sharing relationships between the CIA and its primary European counterparts, BND in Germany, DGSE in France, MI6 in Britain, were quietly downgraded from full partnership status to limited liaison status. Full partnership means real-time sharing of raw intelligence, joint analysis, and reciprocal access to collection assets. Limited liaison means sanitized summaries, delayed distribution, and no access to collection architecture. The practical difference in the context of an active military operation is the difference between seeing what your allies see in real time and receiving a weekly briefing on what they decided you needed to know. American military planners operating in the Iran theater have been receiving the limited liaison product for 3 weeks. They have been making targeting decisions, route planning decisions, and force protection decisions based on intelligence that is sanitized, delayed, and filtered through the priorities of intelligence services that have formally downgraded their cooperation with the operation they are not supporting. The government told you the operation was proceeding successfully. It has been proceeding on degraded intelligence for 21 days. That is not an alliance disagreement. That is a change in the operational environment that directly affects the safety of the Americans conducting the operation, and the public was not told. The intelligence cutoff is the physical form of what the 27 signatures mean. It is the diplomatic statement translated into operational consequence. And every American service member in that theater is now operating with less information than they had 3 weeks ago, because the allies whose intelligence architecture they were relying on have formally decided they are not parties to this operation. If this channel is the first place you have seen the intelligence cutoff alongside the ICC referral request, alongside the 27 signature EU statement assembled in one place, you are now ahead of most people trying to understand why Europe's formal rebuke is not symbolic. Subscribe right now. The NATO foreign ministers' emergency session that 3 member states have formally requested is expected to be scheduled within 10 days. And whether it produces a formal NATO statement on the operation will be the most consequential alliance moment since the Iraq War. Be here when it happens. Now compare what the European diplomatic documents actually say to what the administration is saying about them. At a press briefing the day the EU statement was released, the Secretary of State was asked directly whether the administration viewed the joint EU statement as a rupture in the transatlantic alliance. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Europe has always had a different risk tolerance than America. That's not new. America acts. Europe discusses. We respect that. We just don't let it slow us down." Europe has always had a different risk tolerance. 27 nations signed a document calling for an immediate ceasefire and requesting an ICC prosecutor review of American military conduct. And the Secretary's analysis is that Europe has always had a different risk tolerance. A reporter followed up and asked whether the intelligence downgrade, the shift from full partnership to limited liaison, constituted a meaningful operational impact on the mission. The Secretary said, "American intelligence capabilities are the finest in the world. We do not depend on anyone else's collection to accomplish our objectives. American intelligence capabilities are the finest in the world." The American military in the Iran theater has been receiving sanitized, delayed intelligence summaries from its primary European partners for 21 days. And his analysis is that American capabilities are self-sufficient. These are not serious people managing a serious alliance crisis. These are performers reciting a posture of independence to a domestic audience, while the operational consequence of European downgrade, degraded intelligence, reduced targeting accuracy, diminished force protection, runs silently through every mission planning cycle in the theater. Here is the part that should keep every strategist focused on the Pacific awake tonight. Receipt number 3. The Pacific Signal. The most consequential audience for the EU Council statement is not in Washington. It is in Beijing. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, within 4 hours of the EU statement's release, issued a statement welcoming the European call for a ceasefire and describing the joint EU position as, quote, evidence that the international community will not provide unlimited cover for unilateral military actions that violate the foundational principles of the UN Charter. China then requested, formally in writing to the UN Security Council, that the EU statement be read into the official record of the Security Council's ongoing consideration of the Iran situation. That procedural request achieved something that no Chinese statement alone could have achieved. It placed the voices of 27 American allies formally on record at the United Nations in opposition to the American position, with China as the procedural facilitator of that placement. China did not argue against America at the Security Council. China arranged for America's allies to argue against America at the Security Council, and used the procedural rules that America built to do it. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published this week and confirmed by 3 former National Security Council officials, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's handling of the EU statement is being studied within the People's Liberation Army as a case study in what CSIS describes as alliance disaggregation without confrontation. The concept, rather than directly challenging American alliance relationships, demonstrate to American allies that their interests diverge from American policy in ways that create openings for independent positioning. The EU statement did not require Chinese assistance to exist, but China's procedural facilitation of its placement in the UN record transformed a European diplomatic document into a public illustration of American isolation at the highest institutional level. The European rebuke of the American operation did not shrink Chinese strategic options. It expanded them, in exactly the way every serious Pacific strategist had warned would happen if the Western alliance fractured over a Middle East operation that the Allies were not consulted on. There is one image from this week that captures the entire story. On one side, the Secretary of State at a Washington podium, flags perfectly placed, saying, "America acts while Europe discusses," projecting the confidence of a country that does not need permission and does not require partners. Certain, independent, alone. On the other side, the EU Council chamber in Brussels, 27 foreign ministers seated in a semicircle, each having cleared the statement with their domestic governments, each having calculated that the cost of continued silence exceeded the cost of the document, signing a page that will exist in international law and diplomatic history for as long as the institutions that received it exist. One side performed independence, the other side documented its consequences. One side said, "America acts." The other side said the action was illegal and referred it to the ICC. One side claimed self-sufficiency. The other side cut off the intelligence that tested the claim. One side called Europe's response a different risk tolerance. The other side called it a formal legal objection filed with the United Nations. One side is performing an alliance. The other side is redesigning one. So what does this actually mean for you? Not for diplomats, for the person watching this. If you have retirement savings in any fund with European equity exposure, and most broad market international funds carry 18 to 24% European equity weight, the diplomatic rupture is not yet priced into markets because investors are still treating it as a temporary disagreement rather than a structural reorientation. The intelligence downgrade and the ICC referral are the indicators that tell you it is not temporary. When institutions begin creating permanent legal records of their objections, they are not positioning for a quick return to normal. The repricing that follows that recognition will not be gradual in the sectors most exposed to transatlantic business relationships. If you work in any sector that depends on European market access, in financial services, in defense, in advanced manufacturing, in technology, the EU statement's provision withholding diplomatic cover from the American operation has a downstream business consequence that has not yet surfaced publicly. American companies operating in EU-regulated markets depend on a political environment in which the United States and the European Union share enough foundational values and policy alignment to make regulatory cooperation possible. That cooperation is not guaranteed. It is produced by a political relationship. The political relationship just took a 27-signature hit. The regulatory consequences will not be immediate. They will be systematic, opaque, and durable. If you are a veteran of any conflict, any theater, the intelligence downgrade is not an abstraction for you. You know what it means to plan and execute a mission with degraded intelligence. You know the difference between real-time full partner product and sanitized liaison summaries. The service members conducting operations in the Iran theater right now are not operating in the same intelligence environment they were operating in 30 days ago. They are operating in the environment produced by a diplomatic failure that began 18 months before the first missile was fired. Their risk profile has increased, their force protection has been degraded, and the people responsible for the diplomatic failure that produced the intelligence cutoff are on television describing American capabilities as self-sufficient. If you are a homeowner or a small business owner dependent on interest rate stability, the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, responding to the economic uncertainty produced by the transatlantic diplomatic rupture, have each signaled in the last 72 hours a posture of extended caution on rate reductions. Extended caution means rates stay higher for longer on both sides of the Atlantic. Rates staying higher for longer means your borrowing costs, your mortgage refinancing window, and your business credit line are all operating in a more expensive environment, not because of anything your household or business did, but because the diplomatic environment that capital markets price in just became measurably less stable. The Secretary of State said America does not let European risk tolerance slow it down. The intelligence cutoff, the ICC referral, the ECB signal, and the Chinese procedural facilitation at the UN Security Council are all slowing something down. And the people who will feel the slowdown most directly are not in Washington. Here is the hard truth. The European allies who signed that document are not America's enemies. They are democratic governments that have concluded, after 18 months of escalating signals and 11 weeks of an unauthorized military operation, that the cost of continued institutional ratification of American unilateralism was higher than the cost of formal, documented, irreversible objection. They did not want to file that document. They filed it because the alternative, continued silence in the face of actions they had formally warned against, had become institutionally unsustainable. The moment the first warning was ignored, the next had to be louder. The moment the louder warning was also ignored, the only remaining instrument was the document. The administration did not lose European support because Europe became hostile. It lost European support because it used it up. One ignored warning, one overridden objection, one unilateral action at a time, and then expressed surprise when the account was empty. Where does this go from here? I see three paths. The first is the diplomatic repair. The administration appoints a high-level special envoy to NATO and the EU, someone with credibility in European capitals, someone who signals genuine engagement. The envoy initiates a multilateral diplomatic process that gives European governments a real role in the ceasefire framework and post-conflict architecture. EU member states signal that the intelligence sharing and diplomatic cover provisions are subject to review pending demonstrated American multilateral engagement. The ICC examination continues on its own track because the prosecutor takes no instructions from foreign ministers, but the operational intelligence relationship is partially restored. The alliance is visibly functional again. But even in this best case, even if the envoy produces a genuine multilateral framework within 60 days, the EU statement is permanent. The ICC examination is running. The Chinese procedural facilitation is in the Security Council record. The repair path returns the alliance to functionality. It does not restore the innocence of the relationship that existed before the document was filed. The second path is the parallel alliance. European governments, concluding the American relationship has become unpredictable enough to require institutional hedging, accelerate the EU strategic autonomy framework beyond its current timeline. France and Germany finalize joint defense procurement. The UK deepens bilateral security agreements outside NATO's American-chaired structure. The EU begins developing its own independent intelligence sharing architecture, not to replace NATO, but to function in cases where members do not wish to share with the American-dominated alliance command. The parallel alliance does not formally compete with NATO. It creates a European security option that does not require American participation. And once that option is operationally real, once the procurement channels, the intelligence architecture, and the diplomatic decision-making process function independently of Washington. NATO becomes one option among several, rather than the only option. The alliance persists in name. American primacy within it does not. The leverage structure that has made American diplomatic leadership possible for 75 years is permanently altered. The third path is the formal break. This is the one nobody wants to say out loud. The NATO emergency session that 3 member states have requested convenes. The agenda includes a formal Article 4 consultation, the mechanism that allows any member to request alliance-wide consultation when its security is threatened. Initiated not by an external threat, but by a member state's concern about the strategic consequences of the American operation. The consultation produces a formal NATO statement, not as strong as the EU document, but institutional, unanimous among European members, calling for a diplomatic resolution and declining to characterize the Iranian conflict as falling under NATO's collective defense mandate. The United States, refused collective defense endorsement by its own alliance, faces the public confirmation that it is conducting a major military operation against a nuclear threshold state without the support, the legal cover, or the institutional backing of the alliance it has led for 75 years. The domestic political consequences of that public confirmation, arriving in the same week as the Senate fracture, the Canadian WTO filing, the gas prices, and the 41, are not manageable by any press conference or rally. The administration faces simultaneous institutional isolation at home and abroad. You would normally say that the alliance's foundational interest in American leadership would prevent a formal public break. But the foundational interest in American leadership was always contingent on American leadership being recognizable as such. And there are no more guardrails. Here is what I know for certain. Regardless of which of those 3 paths the alliance follows, diplomatic repair, parallel structure, or formal break, the EU statement filed at the United Nations this week is permanently in the international record. The ICC examination is running. The intelligence downgrade is operational. The Chinese procedural facilitation placed American allies' objections in the Security Council record. None of that reverses because of a communique or a summit photo. Even if the special envoy is appointed tomorrow, the 27 signatures from yesterday cannot be recalled. Even if the intelligence relationship is restored next month, the 21 days it was degraded already happened, and the missions conducted during those 21 days were conducted on information that cannot be retroactively improved. Even if NATO holds together institutionally, the document that 27 members filed describing an American military action as legally inadequate is now the baseline against which every future American request for Allied support will be evaluated. The Secretary said, "America acts and Europe discusses." 27 nations discussed their way to a document that will outlast this administration. The administration is performing self-sufficiency. The alliance is documenting the cost of it. Right now, in Brussels and Berlin and Paris and Warsaw, foreign ministers who signed that document are not asking whether the alliance can survive this. They are asking what it looks like after it does. And the answer they are building, with funding, procurement contracts, intelligence architectures, and diplomatic frameworks, does not require Washington's approval. Drop your answers in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe because the NATO emergency session and the ICC prosecutor's preliminary determination are both expected within the next 2 weeks, and those 2 events will tell you more about the future of the Western Alliance than any military briefing. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away.